Hello there, and thanks for joining. My name is Patrick, and I am the comic book veteran. Why? Because I collect comic books, and I'm a veteran, so it just made sense. Yes, you've heard me say that before if you watched previous episodes. So today I want to talk about something that is again important to me, and I say that with with most of the videos that I've made to this point, but that's the truth. Uh, Everything you see back here behind me and is around the rest of this room as well is my comic book collection. Okay? Episode 1, I brought up and talked about the some of the first comic books that I owned. Some of there's some of the oldest things that I have in my possession that were given or purchased directly for me. And where I want to go with that is when I was a kid, yes, I read comic books. I had the collector's editions, the big treasury editions of some books. I had some of the other odd and end books that my parents purchased for me, but never anything that was really sequential. So I'd get a Spider-Man book one week, or maybe a Flash book 3 weeks later, and there was no rhyme or reason. It was just whatever struck my fancy that day, or whatever my dad happened to. I'm at the store and I'll pick this up for Patrick, and that was how it went. Um, but it wasn't something that I set out to do. Well, when I was a freshman in college, I was introduced to a game that was called Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, and I became enamored with this. It was a lot of fun. I was fascinated. It opened up lots of the worlds of swords and sorcery. And yes, I have some Dungeons and Dragons stuff in this room. Although I'm not an avid player. Uh, Now my kids want to learn to play, and that's something I'd like to do with them. But we just haven't made the time for it because there are so many things that I would like to do with and for my kids, and it's hard to do with a lot of the other things that we have going on in real life. That's the way it is. When I was in college, I had a house, I had housing, I had food, go to class, show up, and then do whatever I wanted to do after that, which involved a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. Well, as I entered my sophomore year in college, which was in the fall of 1988, I'm going to go to August of 1988. I was in a dorm room and I was playing Dungeons and Dragons with some of my friends. And at the conclusion of one of our Dungeons and Dragons sessions, a young man by the name of Reggie Jacobs, and I have no idea where Reggie is. If anybody happens to know, there are a few of us that would love to get in touch with Reggie just to reconnect. I haven't talked to Reggie in 30 years at this point, I would imagine. Anyway, Reggie said, "Patrick, I think you'd like to read this." And he handed me a what we would now call a trade paperback. And it was a comic book story. And it was about Batman. And I thought, okay. The classes hadn't started just yet. And so I went and I sat down and I read it. And my mind was blown. This is 1988, mind you. The story was The Dark Knight Returns. And for me, that was a game shifter. I read it all that night. I loved it. I wanted to have my own copy. I gave Reggie his copy back, and the very next day, uh, that was on a Thursday. On the Friday, I found out where the local comic book store was, and I hit the road. I walked, and it was, I don't know, probably a good mile and a half, 2 miles to get over there, which may or may not seem long to you. For me, it was just one of those things. I had to walk it, and so I didn't it didn't bother me that much. Um, I was far more physically active then than I am now. Anyway, so I went over there to find The Dark Knight Returns, and he didn't have it. He said that we couldn't get copies of it because it was just one of those things. And, he didn't have. I wanted the trade paperback, and it took me a little while to eventually find one. But eventually, I've managed to generally keep 2 copies around, and one I'll go, hey, here, you need to read this. And I've given away probably several dozen copies at this point. But that was just one of my things, is I wanted to have first prints of all 4 issues. And just wrong place, wrong time, wrong price. And then I got out of comic books for a while, for a long period of time. And then I want to say probably 6 or 8 years ago, I was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And I ended up with some of my books with me. And it turned out that I had a couple of copies of, well, I want to say 4 or 5 copies of New Mutants 98. Right at the time where it was getting super popular, right about the time the Deadpool movie came out, which was, I think, 2016. And I happened to have them, and I was like, look at this, I've got something. And I went to the local comic book store, and I'm going to mention them by name because I have a lot of respect for them. Dragon's Lair Comics in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Great comic book store, and one of the guys that I just have enormous respect for. Bernie, if you ever watch this, you changed my life for the better, and I am eternally grateful for that. And I'm going to start tearing up if I talk about that much longer. Anyway, I worked out a deal with Bernie where I kept 1 copy, he took the rest of them, with the agreement that he would find me a graded matched set of Dark Knight Returns first prints. And that was just one of those goals that I had for a long, long time. And so, to that end, Bernie was able to get me 9.4 first print, 9.4 first print, 9.4 first print. Now, technically, what he ended up with was actually getting me a second print, which is a bit rarer. I did fill this in a little bit later because I just had to do it as a completist. This is actually the one that he got for me. So, where does it say? Oh, right there. There it is. Second printing. And my 9.4 issue number 4. All first printings. And that book altered the course of my life. I went over to the comic book store, couldn't find those until, much, much later, 30 years later almost. But on that same trip, I decided, you know what, I'm going to get another Batman book. And I'm going to start reading some Batman. I knew Batman, knew who Batman was. I had watched the Super Friends when I was a kid. And it turns out that was the day that Batman 426, Death in the Family storyline came out. So I started with that. I read those books again and again. I still have those very books. They're actually really, really nice shape. I'd love to get them sent off and graded at some point. I took the 4 issues from that set, 426, 27, 28, and 29. And a few years ago, I was at Planet Comic Con in Kansas City with my brother. And I was able to get all 4 of those signed by Jim Starlin. And my line to him was, Mr. Starlin, I'm going to tell you that these books led me to coming to conventions and collecting comic books for 30 years now. At which point, Jim, who is a sharp fella, if you ever have the opportunity to talk to him, Jim says, "I'm sorry." Obviously, little humor injected in that, I suppose. But it was really an honor to meet him and have that conversation with him and talk about how my Batman 426 expanded into all of the other books that I have managed to read and collect over the course of my adulthood, I suppose, and going back into the ones that I had when I was a small child. So there you go. There's the story of how I dug into comic book collecting. Now, I also mentioned, I want to throw this in there as well. I don't know where Reggie is, but my friend Kevin Stinyard was there with me through the whole thing. He bears witness to this. So Kevin, know that I think about you. You're like my brother. Love you. Talk to y'all soon. Again, my name is Patrick, and I am the comic book veteran. Thank you.